When I was in seminary, I had a favorite professor, Dr. Robert Traina. He was always saying things that have stayed with me for a lifetime, including one day when he drew attention to the psalmist David's delight in the law of the Lord. Like, it gave me pause. It got my attention. And I've been pondering it since. The law was a source of delight for David. He delighted in the law. Like, what's this high regard for the law? That's kind of unusual, isn't it? Maybe even perverse. I mean, who talks about delighting in the law? Well, isn't it rather that we put the word together with freedom? Like, we delight in freedom, but we don't talk about delighting in the law, do we? Or do we? Isn't it more common to feel that our own sense of delight comes from an exhilarating sense of freedom, not from law? How, we may wonder, is there anything enrapturing about laws, or for that matter, things like rules, structures, disciplines, and traditions? For aren't we usually hoping to leave these sorts of things behind? Laws, rules, and such. We want to instead luxuriate in vast realms of freedom. Well, was David onto something or not? Was he burdened or was he enlightened? It was so obviously a big deal to David. He did it all the time. He delighted in the law of the Lord. And he emphasized it by stating that his devotion was constant. As he put it, he meditated upon the law both day and night. Well, he just couldn't get enough of it as he rejoiced in the law of the Lord. Well, go figure. What's going on here with David? Well, David's sense of pleasure in the law, I think, may have had something to do with his realization over a period of time, for he'd suffered by not being in relation to the law. But he'd been learning that when you put your life in accord with the law, with just the right structures and disciplines, that your life tends to start going pretty well. So David, I'm suggesting, had been learning that when you align your life with the law, that you find yourself actually freer than you've ever been. So here's an understanding of the law as something that, in a word, protects you, for it keeps you on the straight and narrow. In fact, abiding by the law protects you from yourself. It saves you from foolishness and idiocy. It's like being relieved to find after a long climb that there's a fence at the mountain's summit. To your delight, upon reaching the mountaintop, you learn that someone has put up a big, beautiful barrier to keep you from plummeting off the cliff. That you're fenced in has the effect of setting you free. If there were no fence, you'd have no freedom to move around. For, as you would be well aware, one wrong move and down the cliff you go. So I think that this is what David was celebrating, the freeing effect of being in a right relationship with the law. Which is true, says Professor Thomas Howard, in all of life, that there are fixed rules that govern, for example, the training of the gymnast, the training of an acrobat, the training of an athlete. Indeed, a strict observance of the fixed rules makes all the difference between success and failure. For example, as any great artist surely knows, it's the interminable self-denial and obedience to the rules that equips a Beverly Sills or a Perlman, like the great Israeli violinist. It's the rules, like it's the bright fixities or age-old truths, or as has been said, the best that's ever been thought or said that upon being followed has the effect of setting you free. So serious athletes, serious artists know that it's the solemn choreography that yields the joyous freedom of the minuet, the waltz, and the ballet. So for David, the law was not something to get away from, but the law was something to be in harmony with. Now, conversely, of course, to break the law, to violate the rules, is to jeopardize your life. Now, the rule breaker might exclaim that he'd like to enjoy some kind of absolute or radical freedom. He'd like to cast off all restraint in order to be fully free, like as in the case of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, like the inspiration for the French Revolution. So Rousseau, instead of lining his life up with the law, conforming his life to the law, he decided to do his own thing instead, which included then, among other things, to freely cast off his obligations to his own 5 children as he consigned them to an orphanage. Rousseau thought himself free. Yes, stupidly free. Free to be an idiot. Free to be a fool. For as Thomas Howard warns, the failure to observe the divine law is the fountainhead of half the fury, sorrow, and agony of the whole world. Well, the downfall of just this kind of fool has been well described by the great 19th century preacher Joseph Parker. He tells the story of a man, we'll call him Y, who had been a keen and faithful worshiper at his church. For years, said Parker, and this is how he describes this guy, there had been sunshine on his face, there was music in his voice, and the very spirit of joyous liberty animated his walk and conversation. But then things began to change. Parker first noticed it when Y one day exclaimed, "My religious views are not exactly what they used to be. I feel a little inclination towards a rather more liberal mode of thinking. I fancy, that we may be just a little bit too tight-laced in our notions." Well, at the time, Parker wasn't unduly disturbed with Y's comments, but as he was to find out, that was just the beginning. A while later, Parker happened to see Y down the street somewhere, and upon noticing Parker, Y suddenly turned aside so that they had no chance of speaking. And Parker wondered to himself, why has he turned away? Why is he avoiding me? He's never done that before. After that, Parker noticed more and more there was an uneasiness in his look. Whenever he happened to see him, he would notice that his glance was excited and inquiring rather than assured and trustful. And in time, Y appeared less and less at church services. Parker wondered if he'd done something to offend the man, so he sought him out. When they met, Y exclaimed, "The old way of looking at things suits me no longer. The fact is, I have taken a dislike to the old orthodoxy. I want something broader, more liberal, if you'll excuse me, something more rational and progressive." So Y went on to say that he was no longer interested in reading the Bible and had instead subscribed to a publication called The Advanced Thinker. Well, now an advanced thinker, he felt himself to be free. And as Parker learned, he felt himself to be so free that he had engaged in shady business practices, which accounted more than anything else for the change in his behavior. When Parker tried to talk to him about it, Y screamed at him, "Don't lecture me. I hate being lectured." Well, Y had been found out. Now the cloak was off. And the change, says Parker, in the man's face was quite startling. Every line had been twisted into a knot of suspicion. The pure colors of earlier times had run into one another and culminated in an expression of trouble and excitement most painful and even threatening in its intensity. Well, there's a verse from Proverbs that I think well explains Y's inner state, and it is this: "When a man's folly brings his way to ruin, his heart rages against the Lord." When a man's folly brings his way to ruin, his heart rages against the Lord. Yeah, there's no way he is going to delight in the law being in such a disordered state. He's going to hate it. It's an old story of the slide to ruin in the name of freedom. It begins with an inner rebellion of the heart and probably a subscription to today's equivalent of the advanced thinker. Burn your copies before it's too late.